almost. The one in Slovenia, it's around 18%. His Excellency, Mrs. Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, former Minister of French Republic, member of the National Council of the Socialist Party. She served as the Minister of Women's Rights and Government spokesperson, as well as the Minister of City, Youth and Sports, and also Minister of Education, Higher Education and Research. She is today leading an NGO called One Campaign. And consumer price inflation in France is around 6.2%. That was in October. Last but by no means least, Mrs. Ellen Lapson, Fellow and President Emeritus of the Stimson Center, United States of America. Mrs. Lapson is the Director of the International Security Program at the SCAR School of Policy and Government at George Mason University and directs the Center for Security Policy Studies. And for the United States of America, by June 2022, inflation hit 8.6%, a 40-year high inflation rate. So I reminded our dear audience about inflation rates in each of the countries that are represented this morning, just to know, maybe, let's start off, where did everything start? Like, we had a global pandemic, just where we went out from the pandemic, and that was a global relief. And all of a sudden, there was a war in Europe. Maybe I'll start with you, Alan. Where did everything start? Why do we have that much inflation today? I mean, we know the reasons, but let's start by reminding maybe why.
Good morning,
No, it's not. Yes, it is.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. So we're starting the day with a complicated and I think a difficult topic, but I think it is useful to step back, and it is possible that different countries or different parts of the world will have a different definition on why this inflation problem emerged. From an American perspective, to be brutally honest, you could start with how our previous administration changed the U.S.-China trade relationship. That was a contributing factor to some of the supply chain disruptions. We then had COVID, with all the dislocations that caused. And the war in Ukraine has clearly, by its impact on food distribution, on energy distribution, has clearly been another factor. So we now see that sanctions against Russia could also be a contributing factor of further disruptions in energy relationships, etc. So it's a very complicated picture, and yet what we see is our governments tend to work one problem at a time, even though the problems are so amazingly interrelated, and that you try to resolve one set of issues and it will pop up in another, it will create secondary effects. So very simply, at least in the US and I think the UK, the dramatic rise in interest rates as an anti-inflation intervention will have secondary effects. We are already seeing in the US market, at least, very dramatic human interest stories about people who were trying to buy a house have canceled the transaction because the interest rates mean they can no longer afford that transaction. So we haven't even begun to see some of the ripple effects of these anti-inflation measures that the governments are making. So we have to always bear in mind that we can't isolate inflation as a standalone problem set. The policy responses have to be agile enough to take into effect all the contributing factors to inflation, the underlying dynamics that created the problem in the first place.
Yes, that was the American stance for the reasons behind this historical inflation. What about the EU, the European Union stance? I'll start with you, Miroslav. So, actually, public policies are important, but interest rates, and ECB just announced 1.75 raise of the interest rate. So what is the role, what can a central bank, European, let's say, your central bank, how can you cope with this measure from a biggest central bank, which is the ECB?
Well, Slovenia is part of the Eurozone, so our fiscal policy depends largely on the fiscal policy of the European Central Bank. And really, as we know, like the Fed in the USA, now our central bank, European Central Bank can influence these developments to some extent. For example, with raising interest rates. Before that, we saw some quantitative easing during pandemic and so on and so forth. But the basic problem is that the inflation is only a symptom, as it was indicated a little bit. Behind the inflation, there is a pandemic situation which caused some, I would say, which produced some basic causes for inflation. Then we have these sanctions against Russia. And of course there is energy crisis. And we cannot manage this only by fiscal, by fiscal means. We must have a broader picture. And I think that the European Union and the world as such must do much more to reduce the geopolitical tensions, to establish more political stability, more favorable economic environment in the world. For example, we must increase productivity in the next months and years, because we are expecting now not just inflation to endure for some time, but also a recession might come, and so on and so forth. So there are so many symptoms that something is very wrong with the world as such. So we basically need not just political stability, less wars, energy crisis to be resolved in certain ways, but we need much more cooperation at the international level. And that's why I have always been a very strong proponent of multilateralism, because no big issue today, no big challenge, such as climate change, mass migrations, terrorism, pandemics, etc., can be solved by one country alone. Even if you take the biggest countries in the world, the superpowers, they cannot deal with such big challenges alone. We must cooperate in international community. Within that community, we must find a way back to more multilateralism, which was, of course, been abandoned by some leading countries in the world. So this is my broader perspective. We must fight inflation in our countries, of course. In case of Slovenia, we can do it only together with the Eurozone countries and the European Union. But if the world is not, let's say, enough stable, enough cooperative, we will not be successful in all our efforts and endeavors.
Yes, Thomas, do you believe that solution and an answer to inflation? Yes. Do you think that the solution could be found within states or within corporation of states? Like, climate change is not inflation, okay? And the needs and the results are not the same.
I think that it's also necessary to understand the root causes of the inflation. We spoke a little bit about that. They are partly domestic. For example, the increased supply of money in our economies due to fiscal policies of national states during the COVID pandemic. It has increased the supply, therefore increase also the inflationary pressures. But other factors contributing to such a high rates of inflation in the world are external. For example, in the case of the European Union, it is the energy shock caused by, first of all, Russian reduction in gas supplies already in 2021, and then war in Ukraine. And obviously it is not possible for individual states to tackle these causes alone. Therefore, you always will have to rely on a well-balanced mix of national solutions and international cooperation and improvement in international governance. For example, in terms of how to better regulate the markets. At the beginning you mentioned that we have one of the highest inflation rates in Europe, 18%, driven largely by increasing prices of energy. We have the highest increase in electricity price in the whole of the European Union. And it is not because we are importing electricity. We are electricity producer and exporter. Nonetheless, we are, by deformation of the markets, paying the highest increase in the electricity prices in Europe. So the markets do not always reflect the economic realities, do not always bring a fair distribution of benefits and costs. And we should work together at the regional level, but also at the global level, to correct them.
Do you mean like more policies maybe controlling these markets, or speculation? I mean, the speculation makes a market, like by definition.
I think we shouldn't kill the market because it effectively distributes some resources, but at the same time we should work together internationally how to prevent negative speculations, because you have part of the financial sector not betting on productive capacities of our economies, but on paper economy, be it in energy, be it in financial products themselves. And for many times we have been witness to negative impacts on our societies of this speculative capital, short-term capital, working against our economies and our societies.
Okay. I will now switch to French language, and I will address Mrs. Najat Vallaud-Belkacem in French. So if you need your headsets, please, you have some for the French speaker, so no need. Donc, nous avons passé un peu en revue les taux d'inflation qui sont au-dessus, j'ai envie de dire, du seuil psychologique de 10%. La France s'en sort plutôt bien. La France est en deçà de ce seuil psychologique. J'ai parlé du chiffre de 6,2%, ça c'était en octobre. Bon, ça ne devrait pas changer d'ici la fin de l'année. Pourquoi pensez-vous que la France enregistre un taux d'inflation aussi bas? Cela est-il relatif aux politiques publiques? Est-ce que c'est une bonne gestion, selon vous, de la politique publique française? Je sais que vous êtes socialiste, mais j'attends quand même une réponse assez objective.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Ma réponse sera par définition objective. Je pense qu'on a des fondamentaux, en effet, en France qui permettent d'une certaine façon d'adoucir les chocs indéniablement. Mais moi, ce qui m'intéresse aujourd'hui et dans la conversation qu'on a, c'est la vision à l'échelle globale et ce qui se passe dans notre monde. Parce que vous avez eu raison de dire que c'était un sujet un peu sombre pour ouvrir une matinée comme celle-là. La convergence des crises qu'on est en train de traverser, crise pandémique, crise économique, crise alimentaire, mais en même temps, je veux dire, en fait, c'est notre monde et il faut vraiment se rendre compte qu'on est en train de traverser un moment qui est extraordinairement grave et sombre, malheureusement. Même si on aimerait tous, c'est humain, se dire, bon allez, on est sorti du Covid, on voudrait passer à autre chose, etc. La vérité, c'est qu'on vient de traverser quelque chose de très difficile pour l'humanité. Et moi, j'utilise souvent un chiffre parce que je trouve qu'il est peu relayé dans les médias, mais il faut se rendre compte que les morts dus au Covid ont laissé derrière eux 10,5 millions d'orphelins. Depuis ces 2 années de pandémie, 2 années et demie, nous avons 10,5 millions d'enfants qui n'ont plus 1, voire 2 parents. Et ces 10,5 millions d'enfants sont principalement en Afrique, en Amérique latine et en Asie. Donc il y a quand même un sujet dont on ne va pas se relever aussi facilement. La deuxième chose dont je voulais parler, c'est le fait qu'on est en train de parler de l'inflation, de la crise alimentaire, de la guerre en Ukraine. Mais en fait, ce qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que les sous-jacents de la crise alimentaire et de la pauvreté qui augmente, malheureusement, n'ont pas attendu la guerre en Ukraine. La guerre en Ukraine est venue les renforcer, mais déjà, on avait, avant même la pandémie, un peu dévié de la trajectoire de progrès que tous nos pays à l'échelle du monde s'étaient donnés, notamment avec les objectifs du développement durable qui ont été adoptés en 2015 et dans lesquels on avait 193 pays qui avaient pris l'engagement d'aller vers un monde sans extrême pauvreté à horizon 2030, d'accès à l'éducation pour tous, d'accès à la santé, de lutte contre les inégalités, etc., etc. Vous connaissez les objectifs du développement durable. Eh bien, ces objectifs, pendant quelques années, ils avaient été poursuivis, notamment d'ailleurs dans une réflexion née de la crise économique de 2008, puisqu'on peut faire aussi le lien entre les différentes crises. En 2008, quand même, c'était de la spéculation financière commencé aux États-Unis, qui avait fait souffrir les pays du monde entier et en particulier les plus pauvres, qui s'était traduit en émeutes alimentaires, par exemple, dans certaines régions en Afrique. Bon, eh bien, après 2008, les pays s'étaient dit, il faut qu'on fasse preuve un petit peu d'un idéal, d'une ambition, de solidarité internationale et de coopération, et tout ça avait donné lieu en 2015 à l'adoption donc de cet idéal des objectifs du développement durable qu'on était censé atteindre en 2030. Sauf que la vérité, c'est que assez vite, dans les années déjà 2017, 2018, 2019, on a commencé à dévier et à faire moins d'efforts dans l'aide publique au développement, dans la réduction des inégalités, parce que quand on dit réduire les inégalités, il faut les réduire aussi bien à l'échelle mondiale qu'à l'échelle des pays nationales. Et donc, en fait, ce qu'on paye aujourd'hui, c'est d'avoir laissé filer nos belles ambitions. Et là-dessus est arrivé le Covid, qui a mis à l'épreuve nos sociétés sur notre capacité justement à faire preuve de coopération et de solidarité internationale. Et je crois que ça a été dit tout à l'heure. La vérité, c'est qu'on n'a pas été complètement au rendez-vous de la solidarité internationale à ce moment-là. Sinon, on ne serait pas encore aujourd'hui. Je ne parle pas du Maroc ou d'un pays comme celui-là où les gens sont plutôt bien vaccinés, évidemment. Mais moi, je regarde beaucoup avec l'ONG qui est la mienne, les pays les plus pauvres du monde. Et les pays les plus pauvres du monde, c'est-à-dire ceux dans lesquels plus de la moitié de la population vit avec moins de $2 par jour, dans ces pays-là, on est au mieux à 15% de vaccination. Aujourd'hui, on est en octobre 2022. On a quand même un problème d'inégalité crasse des réponses apportées, y compris à une pandémie qui nous a tous concernés. Donc du coup, pour revenir à votre question sur la crise économique, bien sûr que la crise économique, elle est liée en partie à l'inflation, à la guerre en Ukraine, etc. Mais comme l'a dit un de mes collègues, l'inflation des prix, c'est d'abord le résultat d'une spéculation. Donc en fait, on a laissé courir, y compris sur les denrées alimentaires, la spéculation, ce qui est insupportable. Moi, j'en parlais avec un de mes collègues, directeur de Action contre la faim, une grosse ONG qui lutte contre la faim dans le monde, et qui me faisait remarquer que, alors qu'on sait qu'il y a à peu près 800 millions de personnes aujourd'hui dans le monde qui ont faim, on manque pas de nourriture à l'échelle du monde. On manque pas de matières premières, il n'y a pas de sujet. Quand on regarde la planète, il y a à manger partout. Le sujet, c'est celui de la spéculation. Donc en fait, moi, je suis assez sévère parce que je me dis, ces dysfonctionnements-là, ils sont pas liés au hasard, à la fatalité. Ils sont liés au fait que certains s'enrichissent, sont des profiteurs de crise, pendant que d'autres meurent de faim. Et ça, les États doivent répondre à ça, et la communauté internationale, c'est-à-dire à l'échelle de l'ONU, du G20, de toutes ces structures internationales, doivent y répondre. Et on sait comment y répondre en réalité. On doit y répondre notamment par l'arme fiscale, la fiscalité. L'arme fiscale qui consiste finalement à prélever sur ceux qui aujourd'hui tirent un bénéfice exagéré des inégalités mondiales pour redistribuer. Et on a vu qu'on ne savait pas le faire à un moment précis de notre histoire récente. C'est au moment où, par exemple, les laboratoires pharmaceutiques développent des traitements, des vaccins contre le Covid-19, et que, alors même que, je le disais tout à l'heure, la population mondiale est très inégalement servie, eh bien, eux font des bénéfices qui font des 50 milliards de dollars, etc., de bénéfices qui sont redistribués à des actionnaires. Et là, on s'est dit, mais en fait, il y a quelque chose qui ne va pas. Donc, c'est tout ça qu'il faut reprendre, à mon avis.
Très bien, vous faites une bonne transition hein, pour Hélène. So, what the most important points from all of you is that inflation is related not only to public policies but also to speculation. And some of the answers might come from countries but also should come from mechanisms, institutions, more global institutions. However, you mentioned, Najat, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that were launched by the United Nations back in 2015, and 193 countries were signing these SDGs goals, and by 2 or 3 years, it's like the machine got stuck. And nowadays, I think that countries have bigger issues to tackle than these SDGs. Ellen, do you think that you know very well the United Nations, right, and the mechanisms of this global institution? Do you think, Ellen, that maybe we should rethink global responses within these institutions? How could countries adopt serious plans for poverty, for inequality, social inequalities, for other climate change, for SDGs? So do you think that, just to sum up, do you think that the United Nations still have this power, still have this maybe tool over nations?
So you've introduced the word power, which I actually think is unfortunately important here. I totally support Najat's very wonderful intervention about, the structural inequalities of the system. Even the response to COVID, we know, was, there were economic self-interested actors in the distribution of vaccines, and I don't trust the markets alone to distribute fairly access to the vaccines for COVID, for example. So I think we still have to grapple with the aspirational aspects of global solidarity, the philosophy behind the United Nations that, when we all work together, we can somehow make the world a better place. And the indisputable reality that the UN system is based on the sovereign equality of individual nation states, and that power still resides at the nation state level. As much as we would like to believe that we've created something above sovereignty, that a collective sovereignty for collective action on so many of the world's problems. So we have to somehow grapple with this dilemma that, in fact, things change in part when the powerful nations of the world agree, but we are transitioning culturally, I think, to understand, whether you want to call it the global south, we used to call it the non-aligned movement, how do we integrate the views of the less prosperous countries who are still very important legitimate actors and represent civil society, they represent the citizenry of the world. How do we get those voices integrated? So my former institution, the Stimson Center, works with a lot of pro-UN countries that really want to strengthen the UN system. And every time there's a big UN summit coming up, it generates some interesting new ideas of how can we improve the effectiveness and the inclusivity. How do we make the UN even more representative in its work? So one idea is to take the G20. So let's remember that the G20 is it's not a formal multilateral institution. It is a sort of voluntary association of the most prosperous countries. It's finance ministers getting together on a regular basis to share their insights and occasionally coordinate their actions, but how do we make the G20 more representative? So in the past, we have seen the capacity of the UN, even NATO knows how to invite other countries that are not members to join in annual summits, whether it's emerging markets or, the Koreans were so thrilled that they got invited to the NATO summit this year. How do we make sure that these institutions are not exclusively focused on the members that are the most powerful countries? How do we make sure that in the room, maybe not with decision-making authority, but in the room to contribute their views are countries that represent more diverse populations around the world? So the notion of a G20 plus is to institutionalize at the UN level the notion that every 2 years the finance ministers of the world or heads of state would gather at a summit level, so heads of state would be invited every 2 years, would be part of the UN annual fall process to look at ways to address inequality around the world and strengthen the economic mechanisms of the UN system. So right now we know we have the IMF and the World Bank. There are international financial institutions that meet on a regular basis, but can we make the UN system more broadly, more inclusive, and more attentive and sensitive to the needs of the larger human population, not just driven by the most powerful countries that are the most prosperous countries. So it's an idea. I believe the UN Secretary General has embraced it. The UN will be convening in the fall of 24 on something they're calling the Summit of the Future. And this idea of an expanded G20 that gives more concrete action to coordinating economic policies to address the world inequality in the world economic system is likely to be on the agenda. So I think that's worth watching.
Yeah, I still have a question for you, Ellen. When you speak about expanding the G20, who are the members? Who are the new members that should be, let's say, included or added to this G20?
The G20 may still start with the core of the countries that joined initially, and it is based on absolute figures of GDP and economic weight in the international system. But the plus idea is to figure out, and I don't think all the mechanisms have been determined. This is at the early stages of brainstorming about the idea, but how do we make sure that in the process, it's much more representative? How do we get countries that represent larger populations but not necessarily wealth? How do we get those countries represented in this process? So they would be in the room, they would be part of the agenda, but whether there are formal decisions made, I think remains to be determined. So it's not to say that all 200 plus countries of the UN system will all be members of the G20, but it is to try to come up with more flexible mechanisms to make these activities more reflective of the world, of truly the world's realities of the population. That too many of the institutions that came out of the creation of when these institutions were created after World War II, let's be honest, the distribution of power in the international system was quite different than it is today. And so how do these institutions adapt? How do they update their practices to be more inclusive?
Yes. Thomas Patriciak, as a former foreign minister of Czech Republic, do you think that by expanding the G20, some historical institutions just like the European Union or the African Union could join? Like demographically, the African Union, Africa would represent something like maybe the third of the world population by 2050. So how do you think that this is realistic?
I think it is realistic, and as it was said, we need to be thinking out of the box right now, because to stick to existing institution frameworks will lead us to the death end. we see that institutions that were tailored to provide peace and security in the world are not capable of doing it. Economic institutions that were established in order to increase the global public good in terms of how people can benefit from international trade and economic exchange are no longer able to regulate international markets, arrange for security of supply chains in a more and more complex global economy. And frankly, I see that we, apart from like extending individual institutions, we need to also try to look at the structural problems we are facing, and I see three parallel layers we have. First of all, it is increasing technological complexity of the world. How can we adjust to that? And how can we bring back the leadership that is capable of grasping the complexities?
Within the European Union.
Within G20, within UN, within
because
economic
I think
institutions
it can be tackled within the European Union first. Like we see today that the European Union suffers from very, could be dangerous dissensions.
Yes.
That makes you smile, that's good.
we indeed have to start closer to our homes, and regional cooperation is a way forward as well. But we should try to avoid the situation that we, instead of fixing global institutions, we replace them with regional organizations only. For example, in terms of trade, it was said yesterday, instead of trying to fix international rules, we are replacing them with regional trade agreements and arrangements that allow for economic integration at the regional level. It helps maybe to overcome immediate problems, but in long run, it is not going to maximize the benefits of economic potential of energy of the world, because we are not having right rules and right institutions in place. So do not replace global institutions for regional, do not fix only. Let's try to think out of the box how to reform it, and how the institutions of the future will respect and reflect the changes in the global power distribution, in also like not only power distribution but also the need to be more representative. And we can start also to think about like how to build global communities of common interest. We have new technologies available. Our societies are now focusing more and more how to prevent the negative effects of these technologies on our societies, instead of trying at the same time, at parallel, to harness the positive potential these technologies can have for our societies. Internet can be a positive tool if we use it in a way to create positive energies and to tap the talent and expertise and knowledge we have in the world.
Yes. But public policies should follow.
Indeed.
So, yes, Miroslav, maybe something to add before me asking you a question.
I would like to add something to what we've just heard,
sure.
Because I basically agree with everything what was just said, and I would like to add that I personally strongly believe that these sustainable development goals have not become obsolete, and they will remain very relevant in the future as well. So I think we have goals well defined. Basically, there are other goals, smaller of their size, every day brings something up, something new. But what we really need is new approaches, new methods, new processes. And I fully agree that such, let's say, institutions, informal or formal, like G20 and so, must become more inclusive. Not maybe in a formal sense, but for example, the members of G20 might invite some state who would represent certain continents or certain regions, etc., like from African organization or South America, whatever, and they could include them into their discussions to hear them. They could be partners at the first stage, and that could lead somewhere. It would be much better to include all those opinions here than just to listen to them in the context of the United Nations. But even the United Nations must remain. We have no better alternative for this international...
Should it remain the way it is functioning right now?
No, not at all, of course. I mean,
it needs a reform.
Of course they need the reform. We all know that. It must reform very, let's say, intensively. There are many ideas. We have been talking about this for years. I know that nothing has changed so far. But still, if we don't have an institution like that, you don't have a place where the countries and the leaders of the states could meet and discuss certain things. So I am very much in favor of all kinds of reforms. There is no time to speak about specifics, but one thing we should all have in mind is that we are not discussing these things and looking for solutions just for us, but especially for our children, for the future generations. And that's why the sustainable goals, the sustainable methods must remain at the core of our endeavors. This is so important. So whatever we do, we must have this perspective. If we just start to deal with the economic issues, inflation and such, with wars like Ukraine war, with other conflicts in the world, Middle East, Africa, Europe, whatever, then we just lose the big picture, which is so important. And the planet needs us, because if we don't reform the planet and the nature will reform us very soon. So that's why I'm very much in favor of more inclusiveness at the international level, of new forms of cooperation. We must be innovative here. And I think that the European Union, although it's in a permanent crisis, can still be a role model for certain things, like political cooperation, pluralism, being tolerant, as a welfare state, respecting rule of law and such things. These are, I would say, some anchors we must really have in our international community to stick to, otherwise we'll just get lost in all those conflicts and different tensions. And we must not forget that, for example, the Ukraine war is not just about imperialism, fighting against, NATO presence near Russia and so on, but it's also about natural resources. And with such a growing population in the world, we will soon have 8 billion of people, and with limited resources, and also limited to certain geographical points on the planet, we can be facing very, very big problems in the future. We all know that, scarcity of water, of metals, of other raw materials and so on. So we must start to look for solutions now or yesterday and not wait for tomorrow. So we started with inflation. Of course, it is a very important symptom of what is going on. We must do our best to solve it in individual countries and together. But we must not lose our focus on all these very important matters which actually affect the humanity as such.
So you mentioned a very strategic issue that is related to the war of Ukraine and the global response to the war, to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Do you think that this kind of action, the global action, this is one aspect of multilateralism? Do you think that it could be applied in other aspects, like inflation, like to tame inflation, like For example, to vaccination, we still have countries, just like Najat mentioned before, 15% of the population only is vaccinated. Do you think this is realistic? I'm using this adjective again of realism. Do you think it's realistic to have a global response to such issues, just like the global response to war in Ukraine?
I'm also trying to be realistic, and I understand fully that there could be no global response to every such issue. We are so different, and there are different political interests and so on. But what I'm trying to say is that we must not abandon multilateral approach. It must be one of many. We have now bipolarism. We have multipolarity in the world. We have everything, just name it. But we must never forget that the most pressing challenges can only be solved within the wider cooperation. And that's why I'm a proponent of multilateralism, not trying to say that this is the only approach or the only one which can solve the problem. Of course, we must start from the local point of view. We must combine local, regional, state, and international level. All the levels must be active, but without cooperation in this globalized world, with the scarcity of energetic and other resources, with all these political tensions, we will not be successful to bring enough political stability and favorable economic environment as we actually want to. Yeah, hope to, yes, of course.
Yes, let's keep hope. At least we have this.
It's very important, you know.
Of course.
And just one more thing.
Sure.
I was very glad to hear that civil society must also be very much involved in solving these issues, because if we just hear the governments are stuck to some extent, you know. There are the dictatorships with their narrow let's say, perspectives, or democracies where the governments are looking for re-elections, and they are limited in this way, you know. So this is why cooperation sometimes can bring broader perspective and relief for the governments, because they simply transfer their part of their responsibility to the international community, and the people are then much eager sometimes to accept certain solutions which are for everybody and so.
And again, it depends on the political will and leadership. And that leads me to my next question to you, Najat, about this leadership, about public policies, but also about this European Union. Do you think, or how far would the rise of nationalism in Europe affect this multilateralism and this social definition? By definition, Europe is social, and would maybe affect even the essence of this union.
Je pense que, en fait, tout est lié d'une certaine façon. C'est les échecs du multilatéralisme qui font monter le populisme dans nos pays, puisque finalement, les populistes ont beau jeu de dire « regardez, ça ne fonctionne pas, donc replions-nous plutôt sur nous-mêmes, faisons du nationalisme pour répondre à tous les sujets, etc. » Ce sont de fausses solutions. Évidemment, je veux dire, n'importe quelle personne qui regarde le monde tel qu'il est se rend compte que le nationalisme ne peut pas fonctionner aujourd'hui. Mais déjà, pour finir sur votre question, donc c'est un jeu à deux entrées, puisque finalement c'est l'échec du multilatéralisme qui fait monter le populisme, et c'est le fait que le populisme s'installe au pouvoir qui nuit encore plus au multilatéralisme. Donc en fait, on va dans le mur. Mais pour revenir à ce que je disais, n'importe qui observe le monde comprend qu'on ne peut pas se contenter de nationalisme dans le monde dans lequel on est. Pourquoi ? Ça fait au moins 20 ans qu'on a des illustrations quasiment tous les ans ou tous les jours de ce que les problèmes sont des problèmes mondiaux. Il n'y a plus maintenant de problème qui est cantonné à un niveau local. Et d'ailleurs, ça pèse sur notre humeur, sur notre sentiment de sécurité, puisque depuis 20 ans, on s'est rendu compte que notre sécurité physique pouvait être menacée par des problèmes qui ont beau se passer à un endroit précis, en fait, très vite, ça fait tache d'huile sur le monde entier. Confère les attentats terroristes, quand ils se déroulent, les Twin Towers en 2001, c'est aux États-Unis, mais en fait, l'onde de choc, pendant des années, va poursuivre le monde entier et chacun, dans le continent dans lequel il habite, en ressent les effets. Donc ça, c'est pour la sécurité physique. La sécurité économique ou financière. Je parlais tout à l'heure de la crise économique de 2008. Même chose, elle commence aux États-Unis, mais vous avez des émeutes de la faim en Égypte, vous avez des crises alimentaires dans le monde entier liées à cette crise-là. La sécurité sanitaire, la pandémie Covid-19, elle commence en Chine. Très vite, on est à l'autre bout du monde, confinés par nos gouvernements, parce que nous aussi, on a des morts. Donc en fait, il n'y a plus de sujet qui peut se dérouler juste à l'échelle d'un pays et qu'en se disant on va le traiter nationalement, on va résoudre le problème. Et c'est encore plus vrai naturellement avec la question du climat et du changement climatique dont tout le monde comprend bien qu'il ne connaît pas de frontières et qui nous interroge énormément sur le fonctionnement global de notre monde. Parce que le changement climatique, il a cette particularité que c'est très clair. C'est très clair de voir où sont les pays qui émettent des gaz à effet de serre et où sont les populations qui subissent les effets. Et honnêtement, les gaz à effet de serre, ils sont au nord et les populations qui subissent le plus les effets négatifs de tout ça, c'est au sud. Je vous donne pardon parce que j'aime beaucoup moi utiliser des chiffres parce que c'est très clair. Cet été, dans plusieurs parties du monde, on a vu les effets du changement climatique, y compris par exemple en Europe, où on a connu des températures comme on n'avait pas connu. Juste, en Éthiopie, au Kenya, en Somalie, cet été, on a eu une personne morte toutes les 50 secondes du fait de la sécheresse. C'est pas des chiffres qui circulent beaucoup dans les médias, mais enfin, je veux dire, il faut en avoir conscience. Les effets, ils sont
des chiffres de votre ONG,
oui, enfin de la recherche scientifique. Alors, malheureusement, on manque toujours de recherche scientifique.
On manque de données, tout à fait.
On manque de données. J'en parlais récemment avec une chercheuse du GIEC. Vous voyez ce que c'est le GIEC, qui me disait la recherche scientifique portant sur le changement climatique, qui est quand même celle sur laquelle les chercheurs du GIEC s'appuient pour faire leurs projections, pour dire on va atteindre ou pas l'objectif qu'on s'est fixé, le réchauffement de la planète, eh bien cette recherche scientifique, en gros, s'agissant de l'Afrique, qui constitue quand même, comme vous le disiez, un énorme réservoir de population, l'Afrique compose à peine 5% de la recherche scientifique et des données qui existent aujourd'hui et qui alimentent les réflexions et les projections du GIEC, ce qui est un énorme problème. Donc déjà, il faudrait financer beaucoup plus de recherche pour qu'on sache de quoi on parle, de quel monde on nous parle. Bon, mais je referme cette parenthèse. Donc, vous voyez, que ce soit sur la question de sécurité physique, sécurité économique, sécurité sanitaire, sécurité climatique, tous les sujets aujourd'hui dépassent largement les frontières d'un pays.
Oui, mais cela dit, je me permets de vous interrompre, Najat. Cela dit, si vous parlez par exemple de la crise de la pandémie Covid-19, ça a vraiment exacerbé le nationalisme. Voire même, ça a fait montrer une sorte de nationalisme, de protectionnisme dans certains pays que l'on croyait très ouverts et puis qui ont plus un penchant d'aider l'autre. Alors, en fait, est-ce que ça a fini par avoir un effet néfaste ou ça a juste exacerbé quelque chose qui est déjà existant dans certaines nations et qui est aujourd'hui en train d'évoluer malheureusement et notamment en Europe. Enfin.
Mais je voudrais pas répéter ce qui a été dit autour de la table par mes collègues parce que tout ce qu'ils ont dit est vrai et notamment ce que vous disiez sur le fait que les gouvernants dans nos pays ont des échéances électorales qui font que aussi le nationalisme, en l'occurrence le nationalisme vaccinal, c'est aussi lié à ça, c'est-à-dire qu'en gros, on essaye de montrer à sa propre population qu'on est le plus efficace, qu'on agit le mieux, etc., quitte à commander 8 fois plus de vaccins que ce qu'on a besoin.
Sur l'énergie. Hein.
Voilà, exactement, et même chose sur l'énergie et tout ça. Donc, en fait, tout ce qui a été dit autour de la table est vrai sur le constat. On comprend pourquoi est-ce qu'on arrive à du nationalisme alors que la logique devrait être du multilatéralisme. Mais on est là ce matin pour essayer de savoir comment est-ce qu'on pourrait améliorer les choses. Et en fait, ce qui ne fonctionne pas ces dernières années, c'est que je pense que nos institutions multilatérales sont à bout de souffle et qu'elles ont malheureusement prouvé que ça ne marchait pas. Et notamment pour deux raisons, enfin, oui, trois raisons, deux raisons. La première raison, c'est le fait que on prétend faire signer aux États des textes sans mécanisme contraignant ou même de suivi. Et ça, vraiment, il faut arrêter avec ça. Je vous en donne un exemple en parlant du Covid-19. En 2005, 193 pays du monde ont signé un texte très important qui s'appelle le Règlement sanitaire international, dans lequel ils s'engageaient, par exemple, à ce que quand une pandémie arrive, déjà en 2005 on parlait de pandémie, de toute façon il y en a eu d'autres avant le Covid, quand une pandémie arrive, eh bien l'état dans lequel ça arrive en informe très vite l'Organisation mondiale de la santé, qu'il y ait très vite des mesures de communication qui soient faites pour les autres pays pour qu'ils puissent anticiper et gérer leur stratégie sanitaire, etc., etc. Tous ces process qui ont été donc signés en 2005, personne ne les a jamais respectés. Et ça fait 2005, ça fait quasiment 20 ans. Donc en fait ça c'est un exemple en matière de santé. Un deuxième exemple en matière de climat. En 2009, les pays les plus riches du monde ont pris l'engagement de mettre à disposition des pays du Sud, plutôt les plus pauvres, 100 milliards de dollars par an pour faire face aux besoins en matière de changement climatique, aux besoins d'adaptation climatique. Ça n'a jamais été respecté. Les 100 milliards, ils ne sont pas encore arrivés. On parle de 2009, on est 15 ans plus tard. Donc, si vous voulez, tous ces engagements que prennent les États à l'échelle internationale et qui ne sont pas suivis d'un mécanisme de contrainte ou de suivi ou de shame, name and shame ou quelque chose que vous voulez, c'est plus possible. Il faut arrêter avec ça. Et deuxièmement, le vrai problème et qu'il faudrait résoudre, je suis complètement d'accord avec Hélène, c'est ok, le multilatéralisme, mais qui est autour de la table en fait? Qui est autour de la table? Si on a juste les pays riches qui nous parlent du monde, ça ne peut pas être suffisant. À minima, en effet, le G21, puisque c'est ce qu'elle disait tout à l'heure, donc G20+, il devrait comporter l'Union africaine. C'est une évidence. Donc nous, c'est aussi ce pourquoi on plaide dans notre ONG. Mais au-delà de qui est autour de la table en termes de pays et de continents, moi, je rajoute que le secteur privé ne peut pas être absent, en fait, ne peut plus être absent. On n'est plus dans le même monde qu'au lendemain de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, quand on a conçu les institutions de Bretton Woods, le FMI, la Banque mondiale, etc. On n'est plus dans le même monde. Aujourd'hui, vous avez des multinationales qui font évidemment des bénéfices qui sont X fois le PNB d'un pays. Enfin, je veux dire, c'est évident que quand, par exemple, vous parlez, regardez, un sujet très précis de la nécessité d'alléger la dette des pays les plus pauvres qui sont pris à la gorge au moment de la crise économique, Covid, etc. Ils doivent payer les intérêts de leur dette publique parce que, voilà, et donc du coup cet argent, ils peuvent pas l'utiliser pour la santé, peuvent pas l'utiliser pour l'éducation de leur population. Donc à ce moment-là, la conversation public international, ça va être de dire il faut qu'on réduise, qu'on allège le poids de la dette de ces pays-là pour les aider. Ok, mais si vous avez autour de la table uniquement les pays riches qui sont créanciers pour partie de cette dette, ben c'est très bien. Donc la France, peut-être les États-Unis, peut-être d'autres pays peut-être la Chine vont dire allez, on accepte de ne pas toucher les intérêts de cette dette pendant les 2 ans de crise Covid, mettons. Mais cette dette, elle est détenue à 30% par le secteur privé, par les créanciers privés. Donc les créanciers privés, s'ils ne sont pas autour de la table et si on n'a aucun moyen de les obliger, qu'est-ce qui va se passer? Moi j'ai suivi ce qui s'est passé, je sais pas, pour le Nigeria ou d'autres pays comme ça. En fait, certains des pays européens acceptaient d'alléger la dette, de dire vous n'êtes pas obligé de payer les intérêts, mais comme les créanciers privés n'avaient fait aucun effort, eh ben, le pays se retrouve à utiliser l'argent qu'il a ainsi pu récupérer pour payer le secteur privé. Donc en fait, ça ne résout pas non plus le problème de la santé, l'éducation de sa population, etc. Donc en fait, moi je pense que vraiment, repenser le multilatéralisme, c'est se dire, allez, on est un peu dans la même situation qu'au lendemain de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, quand on a fait preuve d'innovation, qu'on a créé quand même le FMI ou la Banque mondiale. Ben là, on va repenser, on va imaginer des institutions qui soient capables de répondre à nos grands défis globaux, que sont le changement climatique, les pandémies, mais aussi des sujets comme par exemple les fake news, tout ce qui est autour de la désinformation, etc.
Ça,
la question des nouvelles technologies.
On en a parlé tout à l'heure. Est-ce que ces ONG, vous avez la double casquette du coup, Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, parce que vous avez fait partie un peu de l'exécutif, enfin un peu beaucoup, hein, mais aujourd'hui vous représentez la société civile.
Mais en fait, comme vous le disiez
encore une
tout
fois,
à l'heure,
la question elle est réaliste. Enfin, j'attends de vous une réponse réaliste. Est-ce que cette société civile elle est vraiment écoutée par les policy makers, par ceux qui font des politiques publiques?
mais c'est ce que vous disiez tout à l'heure, je crois, vous disiez à la fin on a quand même besoin des politiques publiques. Vous avez raison, c'est-à-dire que moi, ne comptez pas sur moi pour vous dire comme je suis plus en première ligne en politique, c'est pas la politique qui est importante. Non, la politique c'est très important, c'est absolument essentiel, parce que c'est la personne à la fin qui signe, j'allais dire, le décret, la loi, etc. Et donc on a besoin de ça. Mais la vérité, c'est que souvent, la société civile, les ONG, les think tanks, etc., qui prennent le temps de penser les choses, sont en avance d'un temps sur la réflexion sur ce qu'il faudrait pour améliorer le monde, pour faire du monde une meilleure place à vivre, comme disait Hélène, j'aime bien cette formule en anglais, une meilleure place à vivre. Voilà. Donc, en fait, les ONG, elles ont cet apport-là qui est considérable, qui est qu'elles sont justement détachées un peu des contraintes qu'évoquait notre collègue tout à l'heure, électorales et tout ça. Bien sûr, comme vous êtes en permanence en élection, il y a toujours un moment de conquête du pouvoir où les gens ont besoin d'entendre quelque chose de votre bouche, etc. Alors que la société civile et les chercheurs, d'une certaine façon, ils sont plus froids à l'égard de tout ça, ils regardent les choses, ils n'ont pas de ces contraintes-là de temporalité, donc ils peuvent porter des choses plus ambitieuses. Et après, charge à eux d'entraîner une dynamique, la population avec eux, pour convaincre le plus largement possible les politiques. Mais on a besoin des politiques à la fin pour faire adopter les lois.
Absolument, tout à fait. Cela m'amène aussi, n'est-ce pas, à poser la question, puisque nous avons avec nous Hélène, qui est, je vais le rappeler, présidente émérite of the Stimson Center, du centre Stimson. Bon, c'était juste pour faire la transition par rapport à son titre, et puis je re-switch en anglais. So, Ellen, I saw that you, while Najat was talking, you were shaking your head like you totally confirm what she was saying. And my question is, do you think, like, let's say that there is also a security chaos today. It's not like only about energy, about food security. There's also this security matter. Do you think that governments and world leaders today put more attention to what think tanks and other research centers publish in order to better tackle those issues, especially security matter?
Well, let me say a few things. So I was very much reacting to your thoughts on, you know, the limits of multilateralism and the frustrations that civil society organizations have. And I would add to your list that the Security Council piece of the UN system is even more bloqué than the other parts of the UN system. And we're seeing this now very strongly because Russia and China are now, there's a pattern now of them wanting to resist any efforts for the international community to intervene. So this alternative principle of non-interference in the affairs of nation states is being validated by these two very large great powers, one of whom believes that in this century they will surpass the United States as the most powerful country in the world. So what I wanted to bring in is just to, even though I want to associate myself with the belief that the aspirational parts of improving global solidarity is still something we want to validate and support, but I have to ride the more negative wave, I think, of let's be very honest with ourselves that the problems, some of these institutional issues are getting harder. So I wanted to just mention that there's a debate among academics that I think it happens in many countries, but certainly in the US, about whether there ever was a liberal international order. Okay? And the concept being that we, as in the United States and Western countries, NATO allies, have congratulated ourselves that we created this liberal order that was assumed to have sort of global legitimacy. And what we're seeing now in the post-Cold War, post-single superpower age that we live in, that in fact, there may be emerging an alternative order, that the liberal order was really just the Western international order in which Russia, the former Soviet, well, the Soviet Union was part of that Western order for a while, but the emergence of China and the solidarity between Russia today and China on this principle of non-interference is now creating what may eventually be understood to be an alternative order that is totally contrary to all the principles you've identified, you know, of the sort of, that the true legitimacy comes from citizens and society, not from states. We are seeing these populist and totalitarian regimes believe to the contrary, that the state knows what's best for the people and the state will impose order, the emergence of the surveillance state, the way technology now empowers regimes to be much more controlling of their populations. So we are in what could be a scary moment. While we may want to reinforce and validate the principles of a liberal order, in fact, we are also seeing very powerful counter-pressures to move the international political landscape into a bifurcated system. You know, we can use the old vocabulary, is it a new Cold War between the West and China? Maybe that's not the most useful concept, but whether in terms of how international politics is organized, that we will see by mid-century a China-dominated world order and like-minded countries following that model, and then the rest of the world, and I think that will still be Europe, North America, the Western Hemisphere, Africa perhaps, and so maybe there's an East and a West piece to the story, but whether we will in fact see an erosion of the legitimacy of the West, of the liberal order that the UN represents. So I'm sorry to be dark because I wanted to be more positive, but I think we have to open our minds to that.
So it's like a kind of never-ending Cold War.
Well, Cold War is maybe I'm not sure it's a war, but
there's no. Actually, there's a war at the door of Europe today. So maybe you. So what are the solutions? Let's. Before, and by the way, I'm addressing to the audience. If you have questions, just prepare them. A last roundtable, and then we will wrap up. So let's finish with maybe some solutions to this new order, new world order, which happens to be in chaos. I'll start with you, Miroslav.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't use the word chaos, seriously. I mean, it's very figurative. It's okay, but we still are not in the full chaos. There are some chaotic environments, of course, but the world is still functioning according to certain, let's say, unwritten and written rules. And I agree that we are not in a unified world. We have a uniform world. We have many cultural differences. We have many political tensions. Now new superpowers arising like China, of course. And there has never been actually one world order, a liberal one or whichever. And there will never be, at least not in the decades to follow, another world order. And I'm trying to be realistic, but this doesn't mean that we are not supposed to do something, you know. And here, this is a round table. We are not in power. We cannot do anything concrete. We can only propose things. Absolutely. And my proposal goes in the direction of and cooperation, more solidarity, and trying maybe to make European Union even more relevant in the world, because I believe that our European values are or could be acceptable to a great part of the world, together with the American ones. I'm talking to the US, Canada, and so on, the Western values. But of course, we must also have full respect for other parts of the world, such as African states, which cannot simply embrace our values, but they must also find a tolerant and cooperative way for their development. And this is why, for example, my country, Slovenia, proposed during our presidency of the European Union last year, we proposed a structured debate about the cooperation between Europe and Africa. And these are concrete proposals, maybe even solutions if we stick to them, just to start with concrete, let's say, debates on certain issues like logistics, like pandemic, like, energy crisis and so on. We must start with something. But the method should be inclusive, the method should be open to everybody. And of course we have to be very clear about our limits, where the limits come. There must be some limits if we say, for example, we stick to the rule of law, we stick to the political pluralism, would like to protect our civil society in Europe, elsewhere, because if these things are not protected, then you are in some other story which I wouldn't like to support right now. So we must not be pessimistic. We are somehow, bound to be optimistic if we want to live our lives, but we must try to promote ideas in which we believe in, and that's it.
Exactly, and taking action also. Thomas, maybe something to conclude this debate?
I have 3 ideas or some kind of like ways of thinking where I think we can go. First of all, when it comes to international institutions, we should start thinking about how to adjust them in order to accommodate what I see as a kind of like conflictual governance model. We have to admit that we need to solve some problems together while we do not have to agree on everything. And frankly, what we call a liberal international order, it was also based that letter and practice was a little bit different. It was prepared for a world that starts to work differently very soon after UN and other organizations were established. And the same I think we need to do now. We have to acknowledge that there are major geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions in the world. Let's acknowledge them, but let's try to adjust the governance mechanism to that. When you speak, for example, about the reform of the UN, we cannot certainly push only that the new Security Council members will be Germany or Japan or India. There has to be some other considerations in order to reflect better different power structure, power relations in the world. Second idea, I think we need to start developing institutions that can help us to grasp the increasing technological complexities of the world, because I see an increasing lack of leadership that is capable of understanding what the new technologies will bring to the society. Tell me about any politician in the world right now who understand artificial intelligence, cloud computing, quantum computing, big data, and so on. Almost none of the global leaders is able to even imagine what it is. So bring back closer the reality to leadership and help leadership understand better what a world these technologies will shape, and we need institutions that will help it. digital transformation of the world, how to harness the power of internet and social media in a better way, and how to make these new technologies working in governance or regulatory framework that is rather reducing the harm and fostering the positive side. And last point is let's get back to let's start again to speak about global economic governance. We need to see whether we can restart the WTO in a better way. We need also to look at SDGs, how to make them again a fulcrum around which